people want to read this later. So I'm recording this, right? So by the end of the chapter, you should be able to show how the model of labor market we saw previously imply a relationship between inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment. You need to use this relation to interpret the mutation of the Phillips curve over time. So of course, the Phillips curves did change over time. So you need to show the relationship between Phillips curves and the natural rate of unemployment, and further discuss the relationship between unemployment, inflation across countries and over time. So let us have some background. So in 1958, A.W. Phillips, he plotted the rate of inflation against the rate of unemployment from 1861 to 1957. And they found evidence of negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. So that was good. So the guy was a guy from New Zealand called Phillips. Very good. He plotted that. He found the negative relationship. In 1960s, Paulson and Robert Solow replicated his work and for US data using consumer price index. And they also find the evidence of negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. Soon, their findings become central in macroeconomic thinking and policy making. So their findings imply that countries could choose between different inflation and unemployment. Right, so that was one of their assumption they formulated then. Right, so i.e. there was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Countries can either have lower unemployment at the expense of higher inflation or achieve price level stability at the expense of higher unemployment. Going forward, from then, the discussion becomes a search for the correct target for levels of inflation. Right. Now in chapter 7, we did see that we saw that the way workers formulate their wages, i.e. they use expected price, unemployment, and catch-all variable, right? So that's how they did formulate there. So you need to understand what goes into catch-all variables, and you need to know what happened when so you say that your wage is a function of expected prices, unemployment, and catch-all variables, which could include minimum wages, and unemployment insurance, yeah, so things like that, right? So recall then that nominal wages set by workers depend on the expected price, unemployment rate, and the catch-all variables, which measure structure and institution factors contributing to wage determination, i.e. level of unemployment benefit, labor market protection, minimum wages legislation, okay. So there is a negative relationship between your wage and your unemployment, and there is a positive relationship between your unemployment benefit and your wage, right? We further derive the price setting. So price setting, we made an assumption that firms do not set prices as perfect competitive, but they can put a markup. So they can put a markup on the wage they pay workers to get price. So from those two equations, 1 and 2, we can make the following observation. So under perfect competition, both Z and mu are equal to 0, and the wage setting and price setting curve coincide with a competitive market, labor supply, and market demand curve respectively. So the slope of the price setting curve is more generally likely to be positive in an employment rate wage space. But we can assume that the marginal product of labor is constant. So if you assume that marginal product of labor is constant, in micro, you remember that your MPL is just equal to your wage. So if you remember, if from your micro production function, which means that's just a horizontal line. That's why your PS is a horizontal line. So if the function of unemployment and catch-all variable is linear and equal to 1 plus Z minus alpha UT, where this alpha is the response coefficient of the nominal wage to an increase in unemployment, right? So that's an important thing. Then we can rewrite our equation simply as at what? In the medium run, you're saying that your actual price is equal to your expected price, so that when you come back to your equation, you can plug into there to get that your price is actually equal to your expected price plus a markup plus catch-all variables. by implication, this is actually, if for some strange reason it changes, but it's the way we're looking at economics now, we are not looking at the AS, but it's actually, this is supposed to be the AS equation, which showed the relationship between your price, expected price, catch-all markup, catch-all variables, and unemployment. And all it means is all these variables on the right-hand side are deep independent variables, which explain price, which means if you increase your expected price, your prices will increase and inflation is likely to increase.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay? Right. So this equation implies that an increase in the expected price level lead to an increase in nominal wages, which in turn lead to a firm to increase their prices, P, and that's lead to an increase in price level. Can you hear me? Everybody is following.
Yes, we can.
Okay, Lame. Right. So if you have a question, just stop me, says sorry, and then I can stop and I can hear what you, if there's an issue, right? So of course, all these variables, if these variables on the right increase, your price level will increase. Now notice, if these things are increasing and they are causing price to increase, they are likely to cause inflation to increase. Remember, inflation is nothing else, but it's just a mere change in price over time, or price level over time. So an increase in unemployment rate lead to a decrease in nominal wages, which in turn lead to a lower wage, which in turn lead to a lower price and decrease in price level. So if this is negative, so your unemployment is negative. So of course, if you increase unemployment, it means that your wages are going to decrease and your prices are going to decrease. For a convenient, we rewrite the equation as this. And so we just took, instead of writing F, this part, we replace it with this equation, which we said it is equal to. So my equation, this part is replaced by this term. Now it means then my price is now given by expected price 1 plus a markup and this equation. Equation 3 gives us the relationship between price level, expected price, and unemployment rate. What follows is the derivation of the relationship between inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment rate, right? So derivation then. So from our equation above, which is our fantastic equation here now, what we need to do is we take this equation and we divide both sides by a lagged price. So you say PT, so I just divide both left side and right hand side with that. Now, remember, for this, I can take from this equation, 8.1, I can take that part and try to manipulate it to get inflation. Now, I take P over P minus 1. If you minus PT above and plus it, it's like plus minus is like, that's like adding 1 and minusing 1. So nothing is happening. But it helped me to actually reformulate my equation. In that matter, I can divide each term. So what am I going to get? I'm going to get one term where I'm having what? I'm having a PT minus PT over PT plus PT over PT. If you divide these two terms, you get this part and over itself, and then PT over PT, you get a 1. But remember this then, current price minus previous price over previous price, that is what inflation is all about. So it's gonna be 1 plus that. Similarly, that same concept can be applied to get expected inflation. Now that I have got this relation, and that, so I know what this stands for, it stands for this, and I know what this stands for, it stands for that. So I plug them back into equation 8.1. So from the previous slide we obtained, you plug them back and you get that 1 plus this divided by that is equal to that. So by plugging them back and dividing through, you get that 1 plus inflation over 1 plus expected inflation over 1 plus a markup is given by this. Now, so long as inflation and expected inflation and markup are not too large, we can approximate. So you can use a thing called Taylor expansion. So through Taylor expansion, this left-hand side become 1 plus pi t minus pi t e plus mu, replacing the above equation. So we can rewrite then to look like this. And then, of course, 1 and 1 will go away. And you get that your current inflation is equal to expected inflation plus that. We can drop the time index to get the following equation, which is what is in your book. And then what does the interpretation of this equation then mean? So it means that if you increase your expected inflation, it will lead to an increase in your current inflation. This is because as your expected price goes up, it will lead to 1-for-1 to increase in your price. If wage setters expect higher prices, they set higher wages, which lead to, in turn, to firms charging higher price, setting higher prices. So if you hold expected, for number 2, if you hold expected inflation constant and increase the markup or increase unemployment benefit, for example, it will lead to your inflation as well going up. So of course, if firms have pricing power, if they increase prices, that will result in increase in your inflation. Likewise, if workers have higher bargaining power, which means their Z is very strong, it means they can demand higher wages, and if firms are facing demand of higher wages, they can respond by increasing prices, which result in increasing inflation. So that's why this is the case. Right. Okay, so Phillips curves and it is mutation. So the earlier incarnation then was that the assumption Phillips and Solow and Samuelson were making are that inflation varies around some fixed inflation, i.e. today inflation is explained by past inflation. And that inflation this year is not a good predictor of the inflation next year. So inflation is not persistent. That was the assumption, that inflation is not increasing all the time. So under that assumption which they were making, it makes sense for wage setters to assume that inflation is not changing. So pi E is equal, so expected inflation is the same as current inflation. So if that's the case, under this assumption, we can observe the negative relationship between unemployment and inflation that Phillips found in UK data and Samuelson found in US data. So the apparent trade-off and its disappearance then. So the Phillips and Solow and Samuelson findings suggest that there is a trade-off between inflation and employment. That's what they said initially. But was that true? If policymakers are willing to accept more inflation, they could achieve lower unemployment. The relationship between unemployment and inflation showed by equation 4 fit the data very well during this time. But this is not true over time. 1970s and going forward, there was so remember that in 1973 there was this thing called there was an oil prices, OPEC, which means prices were increasing and unemployment was higher. But remember that Philip Kepps was telling us that there was supposed to be a trade-off. If inflation is very higher, unemployment should be very low. But in 1973, when there was an oil crisis, you find that unemployment was increasing and the inflation was decreasing, was increasing at the same time. So the model was starting to collapse. So, right. So starting 1970, going forward, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment disappear. Why? Because wage setters change the way they form their expectation about inflation. It seemed in the 1970s, inflation became more persistent. Higher inflation this year is likely to be followed by higher inflation next year. So the non-persistence assumption was no longer valid. So wage setters then start to take into account the inflation persistence when forming expectation. In turn, the change in the wage setters form expectation change the relationship between unemployment and the inflation observed previously. Right. So let us see how do we address this issue. So suppose that inflation expectation is formed according to the following equation. So we formulate, we're no longer using saying that pi E is equal to pi. We rather introduce some variable theta, some factor theta which measure the trade-off. So expected inflation this year depend partially on constant value pi with a weight that, and on last year with a weight. So you are using it's like some form of probability, 1 minus theta plus 1 times theta. So you give it some weight. So the higher the value of theta, the more last year inflation lead workers and firms to revise their expectation of what inflation will be this year. And so the higher is the expected inflation rate, we can consider what happened in 1970 as theta increasing, right? Okay, so long as theta was not persistence, it was reasonable for workers and firms to just ignore past inflation and assume constant value of inflation. For a period, for the period Solo, Samuelson, and Phillips did their study, theta was close to 0, and the expectations were roughly given by that. But that is not holding later. So as inflation became persistent, workers and firms started changing the way they formulate their expectation, and the parameter theta started increasing. So that is now changing completely. So what are the implications of theta starting to increase? Okay, we substitute equation 8.5 into equation 8.2 as in the book, and you get this relation. So when theta is equal to 0 in this equation, you go back, we go back to the original Phillips curve. A relation between the inflation rate and unemployment rate is given by this, which was our normal. But when theta is positive, the inflation depends not only on the unemployment rate, but also on the last year inflation rate. So you have this relation. And when theta is equal to 1, the relationship become what? It's a change, it's current minus previous given by that. So when theta is equal to 1, the unemployment rate affected not the inflation rate, but rather the change in inflation rate. So that is very important. Equation 8.6 or equation 6 in this slide is important because it explains to you that now when theta is no longer constant, it means when you are looking at the relationship between inflation and unemployment, you need to be looking at a change and not a change and not just a level. So that is what happened as over time. That actually this is a true reflection of the relationship between inflation and unemployment, not merely a level relationship, but a unit change in unemployment will result in a percentage change in inflation. Right. So thus as theta increases from 0 to 1, the relationship between unemployment rate and inflation rate disappear, right? So that was what happened. So this was our initial equation. The above can be written as that is equal to this. The solution for the above equation depends on the way expectations are formed. So this was where we started initially, but if we use adaptive expectation, i.e. saying current inflation is a proportion of last year inflation minus the deviation of unemployment rate, then that is how adaptive expectation look like. Okay, so if theta is 0, of course you get that pi t is just a deviation of your unemployment. And in the adaptive equation, we get the original PC. The coefficient theta then, what does this measure? It measures the trade-off between what? Unemployment and what? Deviation in unemployment and inflation. Right. So the coefficient theta measures the extent of trade-off between inflation and unemployment and are very important policy interpretation. So you need to remember that a macroeconomic policy that reduces unemployment by 1% increases inflation by theta. So you need to remember that. Phillips curves and the natural rate of unemployment. So when you talk about the natural rate of unemployment, you're merely talking about when all the gaps in the economy have closed, the unemployment which persisted then is what we call a natural rate of unemployment. So the original Phillips curves implied that there was no such thing as a natural rate of unemployment. So remember, that's a difference between the modern Phillips curves and the natural rate of unemployment, the old Phillips curves. The old Phillips curves say there was no natural rate of unemployment. The modern Phillips curves acknowledge the presence of natural rate of unemployment. I.e., if policymakers were willing to tolerate higher inflation rate, they could maintain a lower unemployment rate forever. And that's not necessarily true. So original Phillips curves held perfectly in 1960s. Yes, Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps questioned the existence of such trade-off between inflation and employment. So they argue that such trade-off could only exist if wage setters systematically underpredicted inflation. But that was not actually likely to persist forever. So further, Friedman and Phelps argue that if the government attempted to sustain lower unemployment by accepting higher inflation, the trade-off will ultimately disappear, i.e. unemployment rate could not be sustained below certain levels. So there could be a level where unemployment, government cannot actually influence it. And that is what natural rate of unemployment is. So by definition, the natural rate of unemployment is an employment rate at which the actual price level is equal to the expected price level. And only things which, and so it means you cannot now use policy like try to manage inflation to influence the rate of unemployment. That's unemployment which persists, right? So if you say P equal to PE in our equation, you can write it in that way, and we solve for natural rate of unemployment to get this, which show that increase in both catch-all variables and a markup raises the natural rate of unemployment. So of course, remember firms can do collusion and increase whatever and influence the natural rate of unemployment. Now remember, those are the factors which affect your natural rate of unemployment. If your markup is close to zero, i.e. firms are like behaving like perfect competition, we can approximate the natural rate of unemployment to be this, right? Which is, this is what natural non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So NAIRU is nothing else but it's a non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Now we can rewrite our equation again, so you can actually rewrite to get in this form, which you already know. So if this is well approximated, then by this, then the equation finally becomes that. So equation 11 is telling me that deviation in unemployment rate is given by deviation in inflation, or a change in inflation is given by a change in unemployment. Right, so implication of equation, of this equation, right? It depicts the relationship between unemployment, natural rate of unemployment, and inflation. So when your current unemployment is less than your natural rate of unemployment, it means your current inflation is greater than your previous inflation. The opposite hold as well. So remember that. We ask you a question where we expect you to know this relationship derived from this equation 8.1 or equation 11, whichever one you prefer. So let us have a summary so far. So the relationship between unemployment and inflation today is well captured by the relationship between the change in inflation rate and deviation of unemployment. So this equation captures the reality of what is happening today in the economy compared to what Solo and Phillips come up earlier. Right. So when unemployment is greater than natural rate of unemployment, the inflation rate decreases. When unemployment rate is less than natural rate, the inflation rate typically increases. Variation in natural rate across countries. So let us, okay, so what causes variation in natural rate across countries? Now remember, I say that if you come here, you say that your natural rate was a function of your markup and your catch-all variables. So surely the way firms operate in different countries is not the same, depend on the way firms can formulate markups. So if you look, for example, South Africa, they have very strong union, which means that is very, very, very strong in South Africa, which affect the natural rate of unemployment in South Africa, right? Similarly, so the reason then why there is variation is because the factors like U and Z varies. So the factors varies across countries. So your markup and your catch-all variables vary across countries and vary over time as well. As countries like, for example, China now, they have so much innovation, they can innovate, they can change this, the firms can have different markup over time. So those are the reason why your natural rate of unemployment might vary over time. Okay, higher inflation and the Phillips curve relation. So recall that in 1970s, as inflation became persistent, the wage setters changed the way they form inflation expectation. The main lessons from that are as follows. The relationship between unemployment rate and inflation is likely to change with the level of persistence inflation. Not only does the way workers form their expectation change, but also their expectation change, right? And the institutional arrangement are likely to change. When inflation rate become higher, inflation tends also to become more variable, and workers and firms become more reluctant. So now, if we are scared of what is going to happen to our wages, we might want to then try to formulate expectations. So the way expectations are formulated will affect the way we actually negotiate for our wages. Okay, so if then that's an issue, workers then know that actually if inflation is going to change and unemployment is likely to change, maybe the way we formulate our expectation need to account for these changes, right? So what do? workers decided that firms and workers decided that they are actually going to index your wage, right? So what's a wage indexation? Wage indexation is a provision such that in wages and inflation adjust automatically. We kind of want to find a way that we are not going to become victim of fluctuation in wage. Okay, to see this, let's take an example of an economic with two types of labor contracts. So one is indexed with a proportion of alpha, lambda, and the other one then is the one which is not indexed is 1 minus lambda. So when you introduce that, you can rewrite your equation like this. So when alpha is equal to 0, all wage setters on the all wages are set on the basis that this is equal to this, i.e. pi expected inflation is equal to previous inflation, and the equation just reduced to that, which is what we had in as equation 9. When the proportion at which you are indexing is greater than 0, the portion of the wage is set on the basis of actual inflation rather than expected inflation. So we substitute that in the equation and we get this. This implies that wages indexation increase the effect of unemployment on inflation. So remember that when we talked about wage indexation, it actually increases the effect of unemployment on inflation. Now it has a huge impact. Compare here, you only have it alpha over is a deviation over a deviation minus alpha ut minus un. But here it is different. It's alpha 1 minus lambda deviation on that, right? So the higher the proportion of a contract that are indexed, the larger is the effect on unemployment has on the changes in the inflation level. In summary, without wage indexation, lower unemployment increases wages, which in turn increases prices. But because wages do not respond right away, there is no further increase in the price within a year. With wage indexation, an increase in price leads to a further increase in wages within a year, which lead to a further increase in price within a year, and so on, and so on. So that the effect of unemployment in inflation within a year is higher. So that is what wage indexation do. It has a huge impact on your unemployment. All right. Okay, so those are things which are very important. So that is what you need to remember, and those are things you have to pay attention to. So summary, this is not a replacement for you reading the book. Make sure you read the book. I'm going to stop here and welcome you to ask any question if you have. And yeah, so I'm stopping now. Yeah, anyone? I need question. Yeah.